The schoolhouse, a relic from the past, still stands at the edge of the blackwood pines, its timbers gray with rot, its windows blind with dust. Farmers along the ridge say it is only the wind that makes the boards groan at night, only the weather that forces the doors to creak against their rusted hinges. Yet those who have dared step beyond its sagging porch claim the air inside feels strangely heavy, like a breath held too long, waiting to be released. Dust hangs in the rafters in such a way that it seems to move against the draft, as though stirred by unseen footsteps. In 1867, a year marked by the end of the Civil War and the beginning of Reconstruction, 19 girls crossed that threshold to begin their lessons in the one-room school of Hollow Creek. By the year's end, only 2 remained alive. None could explain the sounds of recitation that continued long after class was dismissed, nor the strange stains that blossomed black upon the floorboards. Before we delve into the forgotten tale of Hollow Creek and the mystery that silenced an entire schoolhouse, I urge you to subscribe now. By doing so, you will ensure that you never miss these chilling stories from the shadows of America's past. Your subscription will not only keep you updated, but also show your support for the preservation of these historical mysteries. Hollow Creek was a village that was almost forgotten before it was even established. Settled along the fringe of Pennsylvania woodland where the blackwood pines pressed thick against human ambition, it had grown from no more than a hunting camp and iron-smelting outpost into a settlement of just a few dozen families. The men worked the coal veins that rippled beneath the hills, their faces blackened with soot and lined by the smoke of their furnaces. Women kept small homesteads, tending meager gardens, raising children, and carrying water up from the creek that lent the place its name, a stream that carved its way through stone and left behind pools as cold and black as slate. By 1867, the Civil War had ended and the country had begun to patch itself back together. But there were corners of America where peace brought little comfort. In Hollow Creek, industry came and went like passing storms, lured by promised seams of iron or coal, only to abandon them when the earth proved stingier than the men who clawed at it. Families who stayed behind lived out lives so isolated that the world beyond the ridges seemed like another country altogether, a place where the whispers of the wind and the rustling of leaves were the only sounds that broke the silence. A school had long been promised, but never delivered. Children were taught scraps of literacy at home, often no more than what their parents themselves remembered, and many grew to adulthood knowing numbers up to the count of their livestock and letters only well enough to sign their names. But the railway had pushed eastward and word came down from the county seat that a teacher had been assigned, the daughter of a Pennsylvania minister. A one-room schoolhouse would be raised, and every child in Hollow Creek, boys and girls alike, would be summoned to civil order, if only for a few hours each day. They built it quickly that spring, hammering together rough boards beneath the watchful trees that lined the ridge. The schoolhouse sat alone upon a clearing too narrow for fields, the forest pressing in so closely that its branches seemed to claw at the windows. A bell was mounted over its pitched roof, though the sound rang strangely flat. Some said the iron was thin. Others whispered that the woods themselves muffled its voice. Still, it was finished by the thaw of April. Painted white as lime could make it, perched lonely as a gravestone beneath the weight of the trees, in a place where the shadows seemed to linger longer than they should, and the air felt colder than it was. Her name was Miss Margaret Renshaw, and she arrived by wagon in late March. Barely 24, she dressed with the plain dignity of a minister's daughter, her clothes a simple reflection of her modest upbringing. Her hair was dark, her manner reserved, and her eyes, some said, carried a kind of sharp watchfulness uncommon for her age. She had trained at a seminary in Harrisburg and taken the post as much out of necessity as a calling. Her family had fallen hard during the war, and teaching was a respectable profession. She stepped from the wagon with a satchel of books and a brass crucifix that glinted against the drab fog rolling from the pines. The villagers welcomed her with a mix of relief and suspicion. Education was a fine thing, but it carried the scent of intrusion, of outside ways being imposed upon lives that had for decades survived on their own, with their own stubborn logic. Yet Margaret's manner calmed most doubts. She moved like a woman with purpose, neither boastful nor timid, and set about putting the school in order before the first child crossed its threshold. She cleaned the floors, arranged the benches, hung her crucifix above the slate board, and polished the iron bell until it shone like a shard of frozen sunlight. On the first day of class, 19 girls were assembled before her. Their faces were pale with unease or excitement. Some were dressed in hand-me-downs patched to threads, while others wore homespun dyed brown or faded blue. They ranged in age from barely 8 to nearly 17, a strange collection gathered more by necessity than uniformity. Margaret welcomed each by name, her voice crisp though not unkind, and she began with prayer as if to secure divine protection before venturing further. When the girls bowed their heads, some peeking from beneath lashes too curious to close completely, the crucifix above the board caught the light again, pale and thin as if eager to bear witness. It was Rebecca Haldeman who later told her aunt that the room seemed too dark, even in morning light. The windows gathered dust quickly, the air pressed strangely thick, and shadows clung in places beneath the rafters. Still, Margaret began lessons with perfect order, quills scratching across slate, voices rising and falling in half-measured recitations of grammar and sums. She maintained discipline with firmness, never raising her tone more than necessary. Yet, every girl remembered that her eyes carried a weight, as though she were measuring not only their speech, but the substance of their very souls. The first week passed without consequence. But the people of Hollow Creek, though poor, knew well the signs of unrest. Whispers drifted along the town's only road that something about the schoolhouse sat ill with the woods. A hunter claimed the animals no longer crossed the clearing. A woman gathering herbs nearby swore she heard children reciting long after dusk when the house had emptied. Others said the bell rang one night without anyone having pulled the rope. Most dismissed such talk as fear clung to by those who had never known institutions beyond chapel walls. But the unease grew. Flames seemed duller in the lamps at that schoolhouse. Quills snapped more easily across their slates. Shoes wore thin after only a week across the floorboards. Margaret explained it as nothing more than the wear of rough timber and the complaining of minds not accustomed to learning. Yet even she admitted in private letters later recovered that the air seemed always heavy, and sometimes she caught herself whispering in rhythm with voices that should not have been there at all. One night, after the second week of classes, a father named Elias Crawford claimed he woke to find his youngest standing rigid at the foot of his bed. The girl's eyes were shut, her lips moving as though reciting, a low mumbled rhythm like rote learning pushed through sleep. He shook her gently, but she would not rouse until the first morning light, and when asked of it, she swore no memory. Others soon carried similar tales, children chanting in their sleep, lips moving in lessons they had not yet been taught. Margaret learned of these incidents but continued undeterred. Her journals, preserved for a time before they too vanished, hint at her resolve. She dismissed superstition as weakness, insisting that knowledge was often resisted by minds wrung tight with fear. Still, she admitted to unease in her ink. She usually dreamed of a man-shaped shadow that lingered in the rafters, faceless, its mouth moving soundlessly in mimicry of her lessons. She marked it down as a nightmare, but her script pressed too hard into the page, the letters deep as wounds cut by hesitation. By the month's turn, 3 of the girls refused to return. The McCutcheon sisters swore the benches whispered behind them, wood creaking to words they could half hear. Their mother demanded Margaret explain why their shoes returned inside out on days they had worn them properly. Margaret brushed it aside as nonsense, insisting that perhaps other children played cruel tricks. But the sisters never returned. For every absence, however, another girl wandered in from the surrounding farms until the number returned to 19. The villagers began to speak openly now of fleeing. Some had considered Hollow Creek cursed long before, pointing to the mines that collapsed too frequently, or to the blackwood pines that never seemed to thin, growing thicker and darker with every passing year. But the thought of their children's minds bent by something unseen that drew a sharper fear. Outside men scoffed at gossip, but within families the nights grew long with whispered debate. Yet, week by week, Margaret continued to stand before the crucifix in that heavy-aired room, 19 rows of eyes upon her, voices rising in half-chanted lessons that sometimes carried on, according to those who passed at dusk, long after the bell called them home. The tragedy had not yet begun, but already the seeds were planted, and soon Hollow Creek would find its prayers could not reach into the woods. The schoolhouse, they said later, had already chosen its price. The spring rains, like a shroud, enveloped the pines and turned the slopes of Hollow Creek into veins of mud and clay. Smoke from hearth fires clung to the damp, and the road that led from the ridge soured to sludge so heavy that wagon wheels sank to their rims. It was in these weeks of gloom that the mood of the schoolhouse, already steeped in an eerie atmosphere, grew darker still. Each morning the bell tolled, though to many ears it no longer rang as a call to lessons, but as a warning, a knell sustained too long in the air that did not carry properly. Yet the girls came all the same, clutching slates and quills, their hair tied with ribbons already limp from the mist. Parents watched them enter the clearing with the reluctance of lambs sent to a strange fold, crossing themselves once the threshold was gone from sight. Margaret Renshaw wrote in her record that discipline was beginning to fray. She found her students lingering in their recitations, voices too slow or too hurried, as though pursued by rhythms she could not hear. Pages turned without her seeing hands do the turning. Slates carried words she had never written upon the board. She dismissed these instances in front of the children, insisting upon composure, but the cracks in her poise deepened each day. The first absence came quietly, like a whisper in the night. A girl named Clara Morton failed to appear one morning. The other children assumed she was ill, but her mother told a different story. Clara had vanished in the night. She was seen last by the hearth, combing her hair with deliberate strokes, though the family had already prepared to sleep. At some unseen hour she had risen, opened the door without sound, and stepped barefoot into the rain. No trail was found, no body ever recovered. The forest seemed to have absorbed her, leaving behind only a lingering sense of unease. Margaret rang the bell twice that morning, a summons and a plea, but Clara's bench remained empty. The girls recited their lessons in voices strangely thin, eyes wandering off into the open space among them. Margaret demanded focus, her tone sharper than before, although in her journal she admitted to feeling a sense of fear. One missing child might be a thief or a runaway, but she could not silence within herself the thought that something else had begun. Weeks passed, and Hollow Creek stirred with unease. A second child, Ellen McCrae, did not return from taking water from the creek. Her pitcher lay cracked upon the rocks, but the girl was nowhere in sight. Searchers scoured the banks until sundown, but again the woods held its silence. From 19, they were now 17, a number that seemed to carry a weight of impending doom. Rumors spread like fog in the valley, carrying with them a sense of internal conflict and uncertainty. Old stories were dredged from memory. Men spoke of the land beneath the schoolhouse, which had once been a meeting ground for tribes that had fled westward during earlier wars. They spoke of voices in forgotten tongues that still echoed on some nights, low and rhythmic, like a prayer but not for any god they knew. The women muttered that Margaret had no business setting sacred scripture above a chalkboard whose nails already bled rust. More quietly, a few suggested that the teacher herself had drawn the girls away, though no charge was ever dared to be made aloud. To Margaret's credit, she did not flee. Perhaps duty bound her, maybe a darker curiosity held her firm. She expanded lessons, introduced hymns, and encouraged her girls to recite scripture aloud each morning. But the walls pressed heavily. The crucifix dulled as if the very air tarnished the brass. The shadows seemed thicker than rain could cause. One night near the end of May, Elias Crawford again woke to his youngest chanting. However, this time other voices joined in. He swore he heard 3, 4, perhaps 5 children murmuring from beyond his window, though only one stood rigid inside his home. He gathered his lantern, called into the gloom, but no reply came, only the faint impression of footsteps fading into the wood. By June, sickness spread. It struck only the girls of the schoolhouse and none of their brothers or kin. They grew pale, their lips bluish, with deepening circles beneath their eyes. Some claimed they slept little, that whispers woke them in the night. Others said their daughters scratched symbols onto the floors, crude markings that no parent understood. Margaret, though deeply troubled, refused to close the school. She argued in her letters that fear would only worsen the matter, that order must be maintained as a defense. She prayed before every lesson, her voice hoarse, though the prayers seemed to linger poorly in the air, like words spoken into water. The third loss brought panic. Hannah Price, the eldest of the girls at 17, collapsed during morning recitation. Her body stiffened, lips still moving as though she spoke a language outside her own. and then she lay still. No mark, no illness, just silence. The doctor from the next town, summoned days later, could offer no explanation but exhaustion from poor nourishment. Yet the Prices swore their daughter had been healthy, strong, and would never have fallen so suddenly. Now 16 remained. Parents began withholding their daughters one by one. Margaret found her benches emptying, lessons faltering with holes too wide to stitch. Yet for each absence another returned, inexplicably compelled. Girls who had sworn refusal one day appeared at the door the next without reason, faces blank with tired resolve. Even the McCutcheon sisters, who had not entered for weeks, were seen once more beneath the bell. When asked why, they both answered with the same words, "We must." Nothing more. The sorrow deepened into something else, heavier than grief. Whispers passed that the forest had reached its hand inside the settlement. Men armed themselves at night, listening for movements in the grass. Women prayed till voices cracked, though the skies remained as gray and unmoved as stone. Margaret strained under the weight. Though many suspected she might abandon her post, she clung to it. Perhaps because departure would mean shame. Probably because she truly believed she could shield the children through faith. Her journals, as preserved in fragments, reveal both defiance and despair. She wrote of a sound resonating beneath the floorboards, steady like a drum, heard mostly at dusk. She compared it to a pulse, a great organ beneath the earth, beating in time with the children's recitations. It was after Hannah's burial that Margaret changed herself. She grew gaunt, her cheeks hollow, her eyes rimmed darker each week. Villagers said she no longer moved like a woman, but like a figure pulled by unseen cords, stiff, deliberate, controlled. And then came the night of the bell. It rang without hand, a cry against the valley that carried where no normal toll had ever reached. Families woke to listen, and though the sound was sharp, there was something oddly human in its cadence, like a voice strangled beneath iron. No one dared approach until dawn. When light found them, 3 more benches sat empty. Their owners have gone without a sign. Windows unbroken, doors still bolted from within as Margaret swore she had left it. But gone they were nonetheless. 13. The county announced that an investigation would be conducted. Men with authority would measure the soil, question the teacher, and decide if Hollow Creek's children were safe to remain. But before they could arrive, the summer solstice came, and the valley endured a night none would forget. The parents spoke afterwards of dreams so vivid they woke screaming. Flames consuming their homes, shadows flitting between rafters, faces of children pressed against glass, though their own lay safely in bed beside them. Margaret, too, claimed dreams of a gathering not of this earth. She saw the benches lined not with girls but with figures hollow-eyed and silent, their mouths agape though no sound issued. The crucifix had turned in her vision upside down, its brass blackening as flame licked its edges. She recited a prayer even upon waking, but it faltered on her lips like words denied meaning. The forest itself closed during that month. The animals ceased entirely, no bird song above the pines, no deer upon the meadows. Even the creek, once loud with spring thaw, grew sluggish as if strangled by earth. Margaret, hardened but weary, made her choice. She wrote to the county that she would not close the schoolhouse willingly. It was her duty, she claimed, to either save her pupils or perish with them. And though she was still young, barely in her mid-20s, her words carried the tone of a woman defeated long before her time. The 4th of July passed without fire or festivity in Hollow Creek. Bells rang only from church steeples, muted reminders of order. And yet Margaret's bell tolled faintly, again without hand, though this time its clamor sounded like laughter. Thin, mocking, stretched too long by the wind. At summer's end, only 11 girls remained. Of the others, some had vanished completely. Some lay buried in graves too fresh, and some were kept from the school by parents willing to endure shame and ridicule to protect their daughters. Yet the number troubled the villagers. It was always shifting back toward 19, as though there must always be that sum inside. Strays and cousins not meant to join were compelled by strange compulsions to sit at the benches. The tally never fell below 11 and never above 19, no matter what fate struck. When a village countersigns itself against its own instinct, the land remembers. Hollow Creek had sown its doubt. The schoolhouse, some said, is now harvested. The story was deep within its jaws, though the villagers did not yet know how tight those jaws would close. By August, the valley was marked by silence. The air itself seemed to thicken, carrying weight without form, and men began to mutter that they felt watched even in daylight. The forest pressed closer, pine boughs extending like fingers over the path to the schoolhouse. The sun struck less and less upon its clearing, and those who passed claimed its white paint no longer caught light but absorbed it, gray and lifeless as old bone. Inside Hollow Creek, few dared speak of the absences openly. Families whispered behind shut doors, fearful of the truth already shaping from rumor. 11 girls came and went beneath Margaret's watch, though many parents tried to bar them. Locks forced, doors opened in the night, footsteps soft upon floorboards. Some girls woke in bed at dawn with mud upon their feet, though their mothers swore they had lain still all evening. It no longer seemed a choice. The school summoned, and the girls were delivered, whether by will or invisible hand. Margaret herself withered before their eyes. She wore black more often now, though she had seen no burial beyond Hannah's. Her face grew sallow, skin stretched tight, lips usually cracked as though she knew thirst that no water could quench. When the bell sounded, her steps carried her like a figure half resigned to judgment. The village preacher visited twice, offering prayers and holy water, but neither lingered long. By the third invitation, he refused to return altogether, claiming that words inside those walls carried no power he could recognize. The county's promised investigation had not yet come. Some claimed their letters were lost, and others feared they were ignored. Hollow Creek was too small, too poor, too forgotten. Whatever plagued its daughters would be endured alone. The disappearances quickened. A child named Abigail Jansen was found wandering the woods at dawn, though her family swore she had lain at their hearth all night. She spoke no word, her hair tangled with pine needles, her cheeks raw from the cold. When at last she whispered, her words brought greater fear than silence. She said she had seen her classmates, those already gone. They sat upon their benches, pale and unblinking, lips moving without sound, and Margaret herself stood before them reciting a lesson she had not yet reached. That week, Abigail ceased breathing in her sleep, leaving no mark or struggle. She lay still, hands folded across her chest as though arranged by some careful keeper. She was buried on a Thursday, her small coffin lowered while the women wept too dryly, the men gripping their hats as though afraid to lift their eyes. Now 10 remained. Margaret taught still. Her slate was filled with words crisp and clear, though villagers who dared peer through the windows swore the benches were not always occupied by those still living. Some saw faces pale as wax, girls long buried, lips opening and closing like fish drawn from a net. Others swore that the crucifix hung not upright but twisted, casting a shadow downward like horns. Margaret denied these claims, though her eyes were ringed deeper with every passing sermon. The community frayed further. Neighbors accused one another of weakness, of bringing curses through sin. A mother was struck in the square for murmuring that she saw Margaret smile too brightly at funerals. A father was found drunk in the creek bed, muttering that the ground itself had claimed his children. Fear bred cruelty more than unity. Then came September and the harvest. Fields yielded thinly. Corn was blighted, wheat was patchy and yellow. Families who had tilled for decades swore the soil was poisoned. And when they dug deeper, roots came up blackened, sapped dry as though drained of life. Their curses turned toward the schoolhouse. Some whispered in burning tones, while others broke its windows to scatter its power. Yet no fire was lit and no stone thrown. All shrank back, aware of something waiting within, something patient, something that watched even their intentions. A story spread through the valley from the lips of a dairyman's wife. She had been out near the ridge one evening gathering herbs when she heard voices. Creeping closer, she saw light within the schoolhouse, though the bell had not rung that day. Peering through the glass, she gasped at what she could not bear to keep silent. She claimed the benches were filled past 19, each desk with girls, their heads bent in unison, though some she knew lay buried beneath stone. Their skin glowed faintly in lamplight, edges blurred as mist. Margaret stood rigid before them, her chalk scratching signs upon slate not of English tongue. The witness fled in terror, returning only in daylight with her voice half lost. Though most scorned her tale, A few knew it rang too close to their own unspoken sight. The strangeness worsened. The girls who were left alive grew difficult to wake in the mornings, staring at their mothers with unfocused eyes until they were prompted to dress. They ate little, though their bodies did not weaken, as though sustained by something unseen. At night, families swore they heard recitation across the valley, quiet voices carrying like evening wind. Not in English, not in scripture, but in rhythm exact. Words repeating like a litany for no ear but the dark itself. By equinox, only 6 remained. It became impossible now to deny. Too many graves scarred the hill. Too many chairs remained empty around the tables of Hollow Creek. The parents pleaded with Margaret to close her doors and flee with them. But she shook her head with an air both pitying and resigned. "If I close them," she said, "it will not leave. It will take them all. Better here, in order, than everywhere without it." Her words chilled the marrow of even hardened men who worked the coal seam. Yet in their hollow hearts they feared she was right, for in those nights shadows grew deeper. Men carried lanterns and their flames guttered as they entered the clearing. Dogs refused to pass the ridge, whining and pulling at their chains. One evening, a farmer's boy disappeared, though he was never among the students. His steps found mark upon the path toward the school, but nowhere beyond. His body was never recovered. The girls grew fewer, but their presence was thicker, as though the fewer their number, the greater their weight upon the valley. Mothers heard whispers behind them while drawing water, and fathers sensed hands upon their shoulders, though none reached. And still the bell tolled, irregular, like a clock wound by no hand that men could see. The town verged upon collapse. Families abandoned cabins to scatter into neighboring settlements, fleeing across mud paths and broken roads in desperate search of safety. In their haste, they left fields untended, livestock wandering. Hollow Creek shrank, hollow indeed, leaving behind only those too proud or too wounded to run. Margaret's health waned until she moved only stiffly, voice hoarse. Yet she continued, pulling her charges to benches, though their bodies now seemed little more than husks. Their eyes gleamed faintly in candlelight, their words scraping the silence like dry reeds. She marked her chalk with signs no parishioner could read, symbols curling round one another like coiled vines, binding letters in unnatural embrace. One night, as the moon climbed red, the preacher of the valley gathered his courage at last. He entered the schoolhouse alone, armed with a crucifix and a psalter. His wife saw him go, lantern trembling in his hand. Hours passed. The lantern never returned. At dawn, the door stood closed once more, bolted from within, and the benches counted still 6. When they buried the preacher's empty coffin upon the hill, the women wept until graves were wet with tears. But Margaret did not weep. She stood by her window that evening, eyes hollow as she stared out across the creek, her lips moving to that same dreadful rhythm as her pupils. By October, the number had risen to 3. Only 3 girls breathed, yet voices filled the benches with 19 tongues. The doors no longer unbolted by hand, but opened themselves when morning came, summoning children who no longer fought or cried, but drifted like reeds on the current. Margaret stood before them as a sentinel, captive and captor both. The valley knew now that the school had become something beyond their strength. Yet they endured, as all poor settlements endure, too broken to strike, too bound to leave. And then All Hallows' Eve neared, and Hollow Creek's long dread came to break. The October winds lashed Hollow Creek with restless violence. Leaves twisted loose from the pines and scattered across the valley like ash, layering roof and meadow alike. The evenings grew longer, shadows stretching too quickly across the walls, and even the creek flowed darker, its waters stained with rotting foliage, until it seemed to carry ink rather than water. Families shuttered themselves early, voices hushed, as if to avoid drawing attention to themselves from something that now ruled the valley far more surely than man or nature. The number dwindled further. Only 2 girls remained alive within their homes, and yet each dawn, 19 forms were seen inside the schoolhouse. Farmers passing by in the morning claimed they counted rows perfectly filled. Girls bent to their lessons, heads bowed, lips murmuring as chalk etched symbols upon their slates. Some faces seemed solid, flesh and bone gleaming dimly in the half-light, while others glowed faintly, like spirits, blurred against the background like unfinished strokes of paint. Yet all moved in unison, the rhythm unstoppable. Margaret stood before them like a priestess officiating at a dreadful mass, her own face gaunt but lit with strange intensity. Those two surviving girls still returned home each night, pale and weakened, trembling with exhaustion. Their parents begged to flee with them, to carry them away from Hollow Creek. But the doors always opened themselves in the morning, and the girls drifted out as if compelled by something no fleshly hand could restrain. When restrained, they screamed so piercingly their parents could not endure it, blood vessels bursting at their eyes until they were freed to make their way again toward the path. The bell's toll seemed woven through their very veins. If the school summoned, they would come. It was then that some villagers decided upon a desperate plan. No longer willing to wait for the county writ, they resolved to burn the schoolhouse on All Hallows' Eve, when shadows were weakest, when the veil was said to thin enough for evil to be cut at by flame. This evil, they believed, was a malevolent force that had taken hold of their children, turning them into spectral figures that haunted the schoolhouse. They prepared in secrecy, gathering oil and tinder in barns, whispering their intent, lest the woods themselves betray them. But the schoolhouse, as if aware, seemed to resist. On the nights they plotted, their fires would not catch. Lantern wicks drowned in oil before striking flame. Sparks died on thatch. Coal smoldered cold in the hearth. It was as though heat itself had fled in revolt. Still they planned. Fear had grown too bitter to sit idle. Hollow Creek was becoming a place of graves only, cabins too empty to echo human sound. As many as 30 gathered near the church on the last night of October, men with tools, women carrying what strength remained. They meant to ring the bell themselves, empty the girls into their arms, and torch the place until no beam stood. The air that evening crackled with a strange charge. The moon bled orange, masking cloud behind its heavy face, and the trees swayed though no wind stirred the valley. The bell did not wait for them. As the sun fell, it tolled, slow, ponderous as though rung by a weight heavier than stone. The villagers froze mid-step, their torches unlit. The sound carried not only through the air but through their bones. The school doors swung open and the children filed out. 19 of them. The villagers gasped to see their daughters among them, pale but upright, alongside others long buried whose outlines glowed faintly in the dark. All moved in unison, barefoot upon the frost-bitten grass, eyes blank, mouths shaping silent words. They did not look left or right, only forward toward the hill where the graves lay, their silence adding to the eerie atmosphere. Margaret followed behind, holding her crucifix not upright but inverted, a symbol of her allegiance to the dark forces that had overtaken the schoolhouse. It gleamed black in the moon's light, a stark contrast to the traditional image of the crucifix. Her lips moved in a fervent whisper, a prayer of a tongue older than those gathered had ever heard, a chant that invoked the very powers that had ensnared the children. The mob faltered. Some dropped their tools outright, confusion and horror gnawing at their resolve. Was this a trick? Was this devilry? Or had grief itself driven them mad? The uncertainty in the air was palpable, adding to the disorientation and fear. But the children reached the graves and began to kneel, hands pressed to the earth. The ground answered. It shifted, not as though disturbed by worms, but as if beating from beneath. Mounds throbbed upward, earth cracking, and the villagers shrieked. The graves opened, not by spade but by pulse, and shapes formed, hands clawing to cold air. The children's mouths opened in unison, voices rising in a chant that no Christian ear could abide, sharp, curling syllables that cut like knives, a language that was not of this world. Margaret raised her crucifix higher, guiding the sound like a conductor of an unholy choir, her actions a testament to her control over the supernatural forces at play. Some men charged then, desperation conquering terror. They swung axes, raised shotguns, screamed their defiance. But upon the threshold of the clearing, their bodies seized. Torches withered, metal froze brittle. One by one they collapsed to their knees. Their wives screamed and tore at them, dragging them back. But the men's eyes rolled white, and their mouths opened as though to join the chant. Though no sound came, still the daughters knelt, still the graves trembled. The villagers scattered, half mad with grief, half leaden with sorrow. Some fled into the woods not to return. Others clutched their surviving children, sobbing. But 2 mothers, driven by fury stronger than fear, surged forward at last. They caught hold of their daughters, tore them bodily away, screaming prayers. Margaret cried out with rage, raising her crucifix high enough to glint fire. But something cracked then, a sound not from the forest nor from the grave, but from the building itself. The schoolhouse groaned, its timbers bent as though bearing impossible strain. The bell rang again, its tone hideous, like metal screaming as it split. The ritual stalled. The grave subsided. Margaret stumbled, her crucifix falling to ash before it met the soil. In that slip, the spell broke just enough for the villagers to seize their chance. Hands trembling, voices broken, they hurled their unlit torches and spilt oil against the weakened wood. For one heartbeat longer, it resisted. Then, as if some barrier had at last given way, the flames took hold. The schoolhouse roared alight, beams curling red, windows shattering with the sound of shrieks behind them. For though the villagers swore they had taken their daughters, shapes still writhed within, 19 forms pressed against glass, hands clawing as if desperate not to escape but to remain. The flames consumed them, face after face vanishing behind smoke until nothing of flesh could be seen. Margaret herself was last. She shrieked words blacker than night, her eyes reflecting fire like molten coin. But no soul touched her. She disappeared into the blaze, crucifix gone, face twisting with defiance even as timber fell upon her. The collapse came slowly, first the roof, then the frame, the bell's metal sagging until it fell with a final clang that reverberated through the valley. When dawn came, only ash remained. The villagers stood hollow, their eyes burned dry. 2 girls clung still to their mothers. No more. Out of 19, only 2, alive and breathing, were carried away from the flames. The rest had gone where graves no longer held fast, where fire could consume bone but not silence, and Hollow Creek, from that day, ceased to be. Families fled within weeks, unable to live beside what their eyes had seen. Cabins were left to collapse. Fields surrendered to the creeping forest. By spring, only ruin remained, and the blackwood pines swallowed the rest. But still, some swore they heard the bell on certain nights of autumn, a toll not meant for the living, but for roll call. When the people of Hollow Creek stood over the smoldering ruin, silence held them longer than the flames ever had. Smoke hung low across the valley like a burial shroud, its bitter sting settling into skin and soil alike. The bell lay twisted upon the ground, half melted, its tongue buried in the earth. Charred beams jutted upward like ribs from a grave. The air carried an odor both acrid and strangely sweet. Some would later claim it clung to their clothes for weeks, unable to be washed away. The villagers, their reactions a testament to the profound shock, gathered in uneven circles. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional stifled sob. Mothers clutched their daughters as if any sound might summon something back from the ruin. Fathers stood hollow-eyed, some with blackened hands from oil or ash, as if guilty accomplices to the thing they had destroyed. They had come to stop it, to banish it. Yet when the flames died, the emptiness did not feel like triumph. It felt like absence, as though the fire had not expelled the schoolhouse, but carved space for its shadow to grow. The 2 surviving girls, Joanna Price and Lydia McCutcheon, were carried from the clearing at dawn, their silence a shroud of mystery. Neither spoke for several days. When delayed words finally returned, they were clipped and stammered, never longer than a few syllables. Their mothers wept with gratitude at their breath, though their gazes clouded with sorrow. Both daughters seemed changed, as if only shells had come back. Joanna refused to eat meat for the rest of her life. Lydia wept when bells rang, clutching her ears no matter how distant or joyous their toll. Hollow Creek bled out swiftly, leaving behind an eerie, ghostly atmosphere. Entire families abandoned cabins, drawing wagons down roads still sticky with ash. They abandoned fields unharvested, granaries left to be claimed by rats, and fences leaning with no one to patch them. Those who lingered only days longer described nights filled with echoes, chanting beneath their windows, whispers rising from the ground where the schoolhouse ruin lay. A coal miner, too poor to leave, insisted he saw children walking in procession across the ridge at midnight, their white faces faintly lit by moonlight. They vanished when approached, leaving only frost upon the grass, though the air was mild. By winter, Hollow Creek was empty. The cabins, once filled with life, collapsed in the frost, their beams splitting under the weight of the snow. Wolves prowled the streets where once chickens clucked and children laughed. By spring, the pines tilted inward, swallowing the path to the ruin so that no cart or plow could pass. Hollow Creek, a settlement barely known beyond county ledgers, slipped from memory. Maps of the valley listed only forest and creek, but memory cannot be burned so easily. The eerie atmosphere of the abandoned Hollow Creek, with its collapsing cabins and prowling wolves, left a lingering sense of dread and unease in the hearts of those who remembered its tragic past. In surrounding towns, whispers endured. Story grew upon story, some shaded in fact, others colored by rumor. They said 19 girls had been taken whole into the earth. They told a teacher who sold herself to something old in exchange for knowledge deeper than books. They noted an Indian burial lay beneath the schoolhouse, restless with blood never sanctified. Some insisted it was simply illness, fever or poison, twisted into superstition by grief. But few could explain why so many bodies had never been found, nor why the two who lived could not recount without trembling. The ongoing folklore, shrouded in mystery and fear, continued to haunt the region, leaving many with more questions than answers. Joanna Price never married. She entered the convent in her late teens, swearing obedience to silence save for prayer. The other sisters whispered about her restless nights, how she muttered in tongues when she dreamed, and how she sometimes turned her face to the east as though hearing a bell that no one else could perceive. Lydia McCutcheon lived longer. She wrote journals into her 50s, where she confessed little of that autumn, but often described her ears ringing with tones that did not exist in this world. On All Hallows' Eve each year, she lit a candle against her window and stayed awake till dawn, claiming her soul was roll-called with the others, and only light kept her seat empty. Her descendants swore that the candle tradition had been passed through generations, and even as the family scattered across Pennsylvania, they never failed to keep the flame burning on the last night of October. But the ruin itself did not vanish. Hunters and trappers swore they found it decades later. The stones of the foundation still blackened, the earth unable to grow crops or moss, though pines clawed nearly every other inch of the valley. In the midst of spring's bloom, that clearing remained barren, the soil cold to touch even when the sun baked the ridge. Those who lingered said they heard scratching beneath the ground, like chalk across slate. They left quickly, some never to return. By the turn of the century, the railroad had carved closer to that portion of Pennsylvania, and crews of laborers had bashed through ridge and stone. One gang made camp near the creek, unaware of Hollow Creek or its schoolhouse legend. They felled trees, hammered iron spikes, and pitched canvas against the wet. But within the first fortnight, 3 men vanished. Their companions insisted that the men had wandered up the ridge in pursuit of game. Yet each tent left behind contained boots neatly arranged, rations untouched, and in one, a scrap of slate scratched with symbols the crew could not read. Work was abandoned within a month. Supervisors blamed the weather and the dangerous terrain. The legend grew fertile with retellings. In one county, it was called the Curse of Blackwood Pines, where children disappeared if the bells rang after dark. In another, they claimed the wind had scattered the ashes of Margaret Renshaw, and wherever one fell, misfortune followed. A preacher 2 towns away swore that young girls in his parish carried faint burn marks upon their palms each Halloween despite never touching flame. To him, the mark was evidence that the Hollow Creek children attended classes still, somewhere beyond mortal reach. The most persistent element, however, was the bell. Even decades after ruin, farmers near the valley claimed they heard tolling across misted dawns. Never more than 19 times. Nevertheless, always 19, a roll call of absence. Scholars who investigated in the 20th century dismissed it as superstition born from mourning. Yet visiting professors returned uneasy, describing the ground as too still, the silence as too heavy to be mere soil. One wrote that the forest's edge bent unnaturally toward the clearing, as if trees craned to listen when the bell tolled. Throughout the 19th century, headlines occasionally hinted at children disappearing in rural valleys throughout Pennsylvania. Few linked them directly, but superstitious families whispered they were part of Hollow Creek's tally, that if any bell called outside its hour, the schoolhouse reclaimed students wherever they might be. Fragments of stories drifted into folklore. Parents warned their daughters not to walk near the woods at dusk. Candles in October windows became a custom among some farming households, serving as a protection against an absent teacher marking names on slate. Even in faraway towns, the tale moved in hushed tones. 19 girls entered. 2 returned. The others still bent their heads over benches, still whispered lessons across the centuries, and awaited their final dismissal. Margaret Renshaw, their teacher, was claimed by some to be a specter, a saint, and by some a demon. Around her swirled the question none could answer. Was she victim, bound to the schoolhouse's hunger, or vessel, chosen willingly to guide its feast? Her crucifix's final inversion remained the most damning symbol. Had she fallen? Or had she known what power she served from the very first? To this day, few return to Hollow Creek's valley. Fewer remain after dusk. The pines have grown impossibly thick, hemming in even deer and fox from crossing their soil. Travelers speak of unnatural chill near the clearing. One man mapped the land in the 1930s and noted the ruins still marked upon the ground, ash scattered like salt above the earth. His journal, discovered only after his death, contained sketches of school benches that were still upright in his dreams. He described hearing girls reciting consonants crisp and clear, though no voice should have lingered beyond fire and time. After writing those lines, his entries ended abruptly. The folklore of Hollow Creek remains among Pennsylvania's darkest. Children whisper it on nights of daring one another to repeat the rhyme of 19 at sleepovers or campfires. But always those who say it with too steady a tongue find their dreams filled with benches. Always 19, even when the camp circle holds only 5 or 6. The eyes in the dream are glassy, the lips moving to words that scrape the ear strangely. And always in the corner, Margaret's figure at the board, obscured by shadow, chalk moving ceaselessly even when no word remains upon stone. The schoolhouse may have burned, but ruins smolder longer than ash. In Hollow Creek, the benches remain occupied beyond sight of day, and the bell tolls still for the absent. For many, the fire at Hollow Creek should have been a final chapter. A chapter closed, terrible but final. Yet even in its ruin, the absence grew larger than the township itself. Within 1 year, stories had transplanted themselves into the neighboring valleys, stitched together by travelers, carried on by coal merchants and wheat traders who passed, whispered tales as one passes a coin hand to hand. Hollow Creek vanished from official maps, but the schoolhouse endured in local speech. It began with children who claimed to see faces in panes of their own one-room schools. In a rural corner 30 miles east, pupils spoke of faint outlines at the window, girls smiling faintly, tapping chalk against unseen boards. Their teacher dismissed the story until one morning he found the slate covered in equations he had not written, some solved and some incomplete, curling across it like a scar left by fire. He scrubbed it clean, but each dusk for 7 nights running, the symbols reappeared faint as afterimage. On the 8th morning, a girl named Ruth Allers failed to arrive for lessons and was never seen again. Her desk, according to classmates, did not remain empty. One child whispered that Ruth still sat each morning, quiet and attentive. She could be seen, they said, if one kept eyes soft, refusing to blink. Another town recounted bells. A farm wife swore she heard tolls echo across the valley at dawn, though their church steeple had fallen months before. Her neighbors laughed, but when she opened her door, she found her own daughter walking barefoot toward the ridge. The girl was stopped before she passed the fence, yet for weeks after, she mumbled strange syllables when sleeping, almost like her tongue had learned another tongue entirely. Each All Hallows Eve, her family tied her wrists firmly to keep her from wandering in the night. By the 1870s, the story reached Philadelphia. Newspapers, hungry for the Gothic hunger of the public, published lurid pieces about the School of Specters. The serious print dismissed it as frontier panic, yet journals of ministers kept mention of girls wandering sleepless, of strange scribbles upon parlor walls like glyphs traced in soot. One minister linked the dates with unusual accuracy. Every 9 years, cases seemed to surface in a ring about the Hollow Creek Valley, like ripples upon water. Always disappearances, always young girls between the ages of 8 and 17, always leaving no trace but whispers of chanting and tolls counted by no hand, a mystery that continues to baffle even the most seasoned investigators. Margaret Renshaw became a myth as swiftly as her school. Some called her a martyr, devoured by something darker than she could control. Others swore she was the conduit all along, willingly binding her pupils to the hunger beneath that hill. In one fevered retelling, she fell not in fire but walked calmly into it, accepted home by what she had served. Another account told that she appeared years later in a town miles away, disguised as a schoolmarm, bearing no scar, slate, and crucifix alike in hand. Wherever teaching benches gathered, parents grew nervous at the mention of a woman named Margaret. Joanna and Lydia lived on, proof that survival was possible. Yet their lives reinforced terror more than soothed it. Joanna's convent petitions often mentioned her war with voices. Priests confessed later that her confessions grew disjointed, thick with images of benches lined in shadow, of chalk writing even in darkness. One brother claimed she sometimes paused during prayer, cocking her head as though listening for a roll call, whispering "here" beneath her breath. She died at 35, fever sudden as a spark, clutching both crucifix and ear as though the bell had called her once more. Lydia endured longer. Her journals were passed down to her grandchildren's hands. They were fragments more than narrative, lines of dread spliced through recipes and farm records. More than once she wrote, "They count. They always count. If they sound your name, do not answer." Perhaps folklore morphing into madness. Yet her descendants continued her candlelight each All Hallows' Eve. Scholars of folkways documented the practice in the early 1900s. 7 households in widely scattered counties lit the flame, each claiming the tradition shielded daughters from roll call. The legend matured from warning to chant to curse. Children dared one another to sit inside derelict barns and call the number 19 aloud. Superstition said if you reached it without faltering, the bell would toll, once behind your ear, once beneath your feet. Most dismissed this as rural amusement, yet 2 such dare games ended with vanishings none could laugh away. In 1894, 3 girls vanished from a barn near Allegheny, leaving only their shoes neatly placed by the threshold. The words "all here" were discovered carved into the wall with no hand admitting to it, instilling a fear that permeated the entire community. The Hollow Creek site itself suffered trespass by seekers and fools. By 1901, nothing remained of the structure except for the foundation rocks, circled by vines. Yet hunters claimed to hear slates scratching when they lingered. One group of surveyors, mapping plots for timber, abandoned the valley after their youngest hand woke in camp with raw fingers cracked by chalk dust, though he had touched no board nor slate in his life. He insisted shapes whispered in leaves, lessons unfinished, scratching at his skull. The crew left him behind in the hospital, muttering in strings of uneven arithmetic until his tongue bled. Even local lawmakers avoided marking the site. No township claimed it. The county archives sandwiched Hollow Creek records between other settlements, yet documents about the schoolhouse often went missing when requested. One clerk confessed that the ledger slipped entirely from shelves each autumn, sometimes reappearing damp as if steeped in creek water. He swore he heard bells when alone at the desk, not tolling to mark the hour, but to count. Precisely 19 before silence fell, such details built into a mythology broader than the facts remained. The 2 girls became harbingers, and the priests became chroniclers. Academics scoffed, journalists exaggerated. Yet the story persisted, stronger than its ruins, a testament to the enduring power of folklore. It infected the land itself. Folk tales grew, insisting that wells soured if dug with timber from Hollow Creek, that ink spilt upon the ground there soaked upward again into books. Children across Pennsylvania sang skipping rhymes about the 19 names, promising misfortune to those who spoke them after dark. Still, the claim most often repeated was that Hollow Creek did not die at all. Some intoned it as a curse. The schoolhouse lingers, held unseen, awaiting its benches daily. Populations shift, decades pass, but the tally is eternal. 19 must always answer. Some vanish to fill it, drawn across miles, their absence neatly folded in police reports without cause. Others appear only when unseen, phantom students occupying benches only half perceived. The living called it superstition. The bereaved called it an explanation. And always, at heart, Margaret Renshaw is in question. In her journals, before burning, hidden lines remained. She wrote of a sound older than hymn, deeper than creed. She wrote that she dreamed of standing not before children, but before figures made of shadow, their voices overlapping with a rhythm not her own. And she admitted, once, just once, that when she heard them answer her name, she almost yielded. almost said here. So her role remained unsolved. Creature or caretaker, victim or conspirator, whichever the truth bore, the Hollow Creek story circled endlessly around the question of will. Did she keep the benches filled against her soul, or did she fight them with her last breath? The fire could not answer, the ruins could not, and the generations since, lighting candles or murmuring rhyme, keep the question alive, as though naming her out loud might finish the roll call begun in 1867. Even now, in modern Pennsylvania, children dare each other on October nights. They gather at abandoned lots or beneath school bells long fallen out of use. They whisper 19 in sequence, and sometimes, just sometimes, a voice not their own answers. By the dawn of the 20th century, Hollow Creek had slipped into the uneasy twilight between history and legend. The earth had covered much of its scar, pine roots ripping through what little foundation stone remained, wild grasses swaying where cabins once stood. For most, the place might have been no more than another failed mining town, abandoned and swallowed by the woods. Yet each autumn, whispers returned. Each autumn, someone wondered aloud about the schoolhouse that refused to die. In 1909, a folklorist named Edwin Talcott, funded by a university in Philadelphia, ventured into the Blackwood Pines. He sought to separate fact from superstition, to gather from the mouths of elders whatever could still be salvaged of Hollow Creek's story. His journals recount cold receptions. Few would even speak his name. But by persistence he found an aged Lydia McCutcheon near the end of her weary life. Her words were thin, whispered between labored breaths, but Talcott preserved them in ink. She told once more of the classroom, of how shadows clung to corners, of how voices sometimes recited lessons before Margaret even opened her mouth. When pressed to explain, she faltered. Only this, she said clearly. We were called, not taught, called. That line made its way into Talcott's essay, published the next year, one that spread far beyond Pennsylvania into journals across the country. And although academics dismissed much of it as exaggeration, the peculiar phrasing endured. It provided shape to rumor, suggesting not just possession or hysteria but deliberate summons. And with it came a question darker still. Who or what was doing the calling? Local accounts during Talcott's stay were equally troubling. He sketched the ruins himself, noting that the charred stones were still black, though more than 4 decades had passed. One night, while camping upon the ridge, he described hearing a tolling 19 times. He claimed he ran from his tent searching for some nearby chapel, only to find silence in every direction. Weeks later, his assistant was found wandering alone in the woods, incoherent, muttering the names of girls none could identify, their tally reaching 19 before he began again at 1. The folklore expanded into neighboring counties. In 1921, newspapers printed the sensational account of 2 sisters vanishing along a farm road while carrying milk pails. Their father claimed he had heard children's voices reciting letters in the distance, though no other children lived nearby. The sisters' footprints reached the bend in the road and stopped entirely, as if they had been lifted upward in unison. The police investigated but found nothing. Families in nearby towns recalled Hollow Creek and said that the benches had been missing 2 seats since All Hallows Eve, and those who vanished filled them. By the 1930s, the story of the Forbidden Schoolhouse had become campfire fuel for children, while folklorists still treated it with wary respect. Some towns even adopted rights against it. Farmers drove iron nails into the thresholds of barns each October, for iron was said to deaden the sound of bells and stop the count from reaching their daughters. One grandmother swore that every year she heard her attic floorboards creak 19 times, step by step, just before the harvest moon waned. She told no one until her deathbed, fearing her words might summon more. Civilian hikers and survey crews occasionally stumbled upon the valley. Few stayed long. In 1947, an Ohio couple traveling wrote to a magazine describing their unease upon entering the clearing. Both claimed they felt as if they had been ushered into a room rather than a forest glade. A bell rang low in the distance, they wrote, though no structure remained. The wife described seeing little desks in the corners of her vision, gone the moment she turned her head. Their letters were mocked, but no one could explain why their photographs of the clearing contained a faint white blur along the tree line, in the distinct outline of a bell. The war years did little to quiet the tale. Soldiers writing home from local counties mentioned dormitories where the number 19 became taboo. One barracks near Reading reported that beds creaked exactly 19 nights in a row, despite men being posted elsewhere on duty. The captain laughed until the youngest private, 19 years of age, disappeared on patrol, his rifle found neatly propped against a tree. After the war, Hollow Creek re-entered academic folklore studies. In 1954, on the fateful centennial of the schoolhouse's fire, investigators retraced Edwin Talcott's steps. By then, the clearing was even more overgrown, but blackened rocks remained, and the soil beneath was, as they described, unnaturally cold. Their thermometers recorded a dip of nearly 15 degrees lower than the surrounding forest. On the final night of their stay, one scholar recorded the sound of what he insisted were children's voices on his wax cylinder, faint, rhythmic, reciting letters in call and response. The artifact mysteriously vanished from the university archive within months. Locals, however, did not need scholars to tell them what they already feared. For them, Hollow Creek remained a place avoided by instinct. Hunters would not load their rifles within half a mile of the clearing. Children refused to gather pine cones near the ridge. In townships as far as 60 miles away, families told daughters not to let schoolmasters call roll after dusk. The phrase slipped into common lore, never answer the 19th call. Margaret herself became almost saint-like in some retellings, despite her shadowed role. Some murals painted by folk artists portrayed her holding 19 faceless children behind her, a tone that was halfway between protector and captor. In one, she raised a crucifix not in victory but in entreaty, as if staving off something even worse. In another, her face hollowed entirely, eyes black sockets, chalk in hand. Scholars debated endlessly whether she had invited catastrophe or fought it. The contradictory images only deepened her legend. By the 1960s, construction crews moved roads near the area once more. In 1967, a highway project unearthed a slab of iron buried 6 feet below the soil, half fused with stone. Workers who pried at it swore it rang when struck, like the cry of a muffled bell. The county coroner, summoned to examine what lay beneath, refused to file an official report. Whispers claimed fragments of charred bone and scraps of slate etched with equations were found. But the highway was redirected, and officials announced blandly that the soil was unstable. That act sealed Hollow Creek in silence once more. But silence in legend often grows louder than noise. Over the next decade, stories spread nationwide in paranormal magazines, each more lurid than the last. One spoke of 19 lights bobbing through woods, each a child's lantern. Another swore of whole nights lost in the clearing, time itself consumed by lessons unending. Skeptics scoffed, but those who lived in the shadow of the ridge never laughed. They had seen how jokes sometimes drew echoes not meant for human ears. Through it all, the refrain returned. 19 entered, 2 came out. And in every version, the bell eventually called them home. The decades passed, and Hollow Creek might have been forgotten altogether were it not for the persistent whispers of its tally. Families far removed from the Blackwood Pines spoke of sleepwalking daughters, of names called in the night when no one stood at the doorway. Others whispered of bells ringing where no bell tower stood. The pattern spread across Pennsylvania and beyond, never quite frequent enough to demand official recognition, but often enough for folklore to grow like ivy across generations. By the late 20th century, paranormal investigators sought out the clearing. They carried recorders, measurement tools, and cameras, each convinced they would capture proof. Few returned with more than fragments, faint voices caught on tape, sudden losses of battery power, photographs blurred into pale streaks despite steady hands. Yet many recorded the same anomaly, a silence that was not just an absence of sound, but an audible pressure, as though the forest itself held breath. Those who lingered longest claimed to hear footsteps around them, 19 paces counted exactly before vanishing into leaf litter. Local archivists began piecing together fragments from across counties. Newspapers and testimonies marked a rhythm, disappearances clustering around October, particularly All Hallows' Eve. Bathing suits left neatly upon riverbanks, boots set straight beside doors, notebooks inscribed with letters written backwards or twisted in unnatural coils. Over and over numbers mattered. Always 19. A ledger from 1972 notes precisely 19 confirmed. Vanishings of young women between summer and autumn in 3 counties surrounding the Blackwood Pines. No explanation was found for the significance of this number, but it became a haunting feature of the legend. By the dawn of the millennium, Hollow Creek's name rarely appeared on official charts, but folk maps drawn by amateur historians and local storytellers marked it in black, sometimes with a bell etched beside the place where no road would lead. Parents carried warnings. Teachers joked nervously about ringing bells only while the sun stood high. And on October nights, candles flickered again in windows, a practice that had spread far wider than the two surviving families could have imagined. Legends always bend to their tellers. In one version, Margaret Renshaw still walks, chalk in hand, gathering new classes every 9 years in some unseen hall. In another, the schoolhouse lies beneath the earth as a chamber unburned, its benches still filled with 19 pupils, their voices echoing endlessly through the darkened corridors. A few stories cast Margaret as a heroine who holds back something far worse. Her defiance sacrifices her life in a fire to delay its spread across the county. This something worse is never fully described, adding to the mystery and fear of the legend. Others paint her as Judas, who freely bound the children's souls for knowledge whispered by something greater than herself. Ambiguity has preserved the tale longer than facts could have. Those who visit now seldom find ruins, for the pines have thickened, choking all clearings. Yet even when the forest appears undisturbed, visitors swear they feel edges of walls in the dark, sharp corners of rooms where no stone stands. One writer recounted walking forward into pitch shade among the trees, torch in hand, when suddenly the air grew stale as if indoors. His fire dimmed to ember, and on the soil beneath his boots were marks like desk feet pressed into earth. He ran before counting them. Only the sense remained that 19 had stood there before him. Even into the digital age, the number returned. Online forums filled with whispers. College students dared one another to recite attendance at midnight. 19 names drawn at random. Several reported dreams that night in which a stern woman's voice asked for their own presence. Some awoke to the word "here" escaping their lips unbidden. Others never responded in waking life, but described in their journals the dreadful certainty of having raised a hand in sleep. One researcher attempted to quantify the tale as purely psychological, a regional myth tangled with cultural memory. His work ended abruptly. The last file from his case contained recordings of bells measured at 19 strikes. Between each was a whisper, faint female insistent. When sped and amplified, some claimed the whispers said names. Fewer dared to listen long enough to see if their own was called. The Hollow Creek Valley remains largely unvisited. The forest guards its silence too jealously. But now and then, loggers or hunters still stumble across a desolate patch where the air chills, where no moss grows, where birds fall silent in mid-song. They return uneasy, sometimes ill, always describing the same smell. Part burned wood, part something sweet, nauseating, clinging long after departure. For those who study folklore, the lesson is never simple. Some argue that Hollow Creek illustrates what happens when isolation breeds fear, when misfortune is tied to superstition. Others insist myths survive because they feed upon real roots. Whatever the truth, the tale of the Forbidden Schoolhouse continues, woven into October air like smoke too thin to disperse. 19 girls entered. 2 returned. The others? Their fate remains a ledger half-written. They may still sit upon benches on the far side of fire and shadow, lips moving, answering roll call whenever the bell rings. And Margaret, teacher or captor, may still record the tally with her endless chalk. Perhaps you have heard bells when none should ring, or recited your own name into the dark without meaning to. Maybe you will remember this tale on some quiet autumn night when the wind carries voices you cannot explain. If you do, count them. If they reach 19, turn away. Do not answer. For if you do, you may find yourself called, not taught, but called, into the lesson that has never ended. And if this story has bound you with the same chill as those who walked Hollow Creek roads long ago, share it with a friend who listens for shadows, who dares to follow echoes never meant for waking ears. Let them know that the benches are never truly empty. Subscribe now so you never miss another tale buried in the forgotten soil of America's past. Like this story if its voices linger with you. And in the comments, please tell us where you are listening from, so that if the roll call should ever reach this place, perhaps 19 voices waiting might know your name.